Jane laid flowers at her mother's grave and covered her face with her hands, crying softly. A year had passed since the tragic death of Amanda Evans, and her daughter still couldn't come to terms with her loss. However, the worst part for Jane was that the man that had hit her mother on a crosswalk still remained unpunished. And now, remembering this accident, the orphaned woman couldn't hold back her tears. Why did it have to be this way? Is there really no justice left in this world? Jane thought, standing at her mother's grave. The fact was that the woman had already turned to the police several times, but each time they refused to open up a criminal case. At first, Jane couldn't understand what caused the police to behave this way. Thanks to one of the officers, she realized what had happened. As it turned out, the perpetrator was from a wealthy family with extensive connections, and so his parents did everything in their power to ensure that the young offender escaped punishment. Sighing sadly, Jane said goodbye to her mother and slowly walked down the alley, which had even rows of graves on both sides. After each of such visits, Jane was devastated. She had nothing to fill the emptiness inside her. The woman never knew her father, and her mother preferred not to talk about him. Jane remembered her school years perfectly well, when her peers mocked her and called her a beggar. That was true to some extent. Jane's mother worked as a cleaning lady in a roadside motel at the time, and so she couldn't provide her daughter with everything she needed. The situation was aggravated by the fact that Amanda Evans grew up in an orphanage and there was no one to help her. Therefore, the unfortunate woman had no choice but to rent an old house on the outskirts of the city and live in it with her young daughter. Having finished school, Jane refused to go to college, much to the disappointment of her mother. "Mom, I'd rather help you. You're already working day and night, never taking a break. College can wait," Jane said with confidence. Unfortunately, the evil fate had other plans, and Jane's dreams were never meant to come true. After the death of her mother, Jane tried to find a job, but most of her attempts were unsuccessful. The woman got fortunate just once, when she saw a job ad posted on the door of a flower shop. Of course, Jane was sure that she'd get rejected yet again. "I'm sure they need experienced employees who know their way around flowers. I hardly fit that criteria," Jane thought, going inside the flower shop. But when the woman found herself inside the enchanting realm of flowers, she knew that this store would be the perfect place of work for her. The store owner turned out to be a very intelligent person, and noticing the enthusiastic gleam in Jane's eyes, immediately offered her a florist position with the probationary period of 1 month. Sure, this position wouldn't pay a lot, but at least Jane would get a lot of aesthetic pleasure. Having gotten the job, the woman was on cloud 9. The fact was that Jane always loved flowers, and now, having gotten a job dealing with roses, chrysanthemums, and lilies, she fell in love with them even more. At first, the woman sold flowers by the piece. Feeling insecure about her abilities, Jane was afraid to even try making large bouquets. But then, one day, she had no choice and had to make a rather elaborate flower arrangement for a customer, who ended up being very happy with the result. "Wow, looks like you're very talented, Jane. This must be your true calling. You must be some kind of flower fairy," said the wealthy customer, who was very impressed with the bouquet Jane had made. From that point on, the young woman became famous around the city as the Flower Fairy from the shop on the corner of Park Street. It's true what they say, word of mouth is the best advertisement there is. Only then did Jane realize that it truly was her calling and that deep down, she was a very creative person. Only instead of a canvas and paint, she had fragrant buds and juicy stems, which she used to create unique flower arrangements. The store owner couldn't be happier with the new florist, who nearly tripled the flower sales in record time. Once, when Jane was working on yet another bouquet, a tall-looking young man came into the shop. Having looked around the room, he stopped his gaze at the young florist. "Sir, can I help you with anything?" Jane asked sympathetically. "You're already helping me, miss. You're working on the order for my mother, who turns 50 today," the stranger explained with a smile. It was only then that Jane realized that it was the same man who had called earlier to order the bouquet for his mother. As it turned out later, his name was Michael Nelson and his parents were very rich. Nevertheless, the man was very polite and didn't rush the florist as she put together his bouquet. This time, Jane outdid herself and made a stunning floral arrangement from several varieties of roses, chrysanthemums, and lilies. "Here you go. I hope your mother likes it," Jane said, handing over the bouquet. Michael Nelson's face broke into a huge smile when he saw the finished arrangement, and a spark flashed in his eyes. To say that he liked the bouquet would be the understatement of the year. Wishing to express his gratitude to the woman who created the miracle bouquet, Michael left her a tip of about 3 times the price of the flowers he purchased. "Thank you, sir, but it's too much," Jane said quietly, her cheeks flushing. But Michael had already taken the bouquet and rushed for the exit. Having stopped in the doorway, he turned around and winked goodbye to the bewildered florist. Jane used the tip that Michael Nelson gave her to buy herself a beautiful new dress and breathtaking shoes on high heels. Looking at her reflection in the mirror, the woman mentally thanked the generous customer for the pleasant emotions she got from shopping. However, that day at the flower shop wasn't the only encounter Jane and Michael would have. About a week later, the man came to see Jane at lunchtime and asked her out on a date. The man's question was so unexpected and sounded so confident that the woman simply couldn't reject him. Like a true gentleman, Michael took Jane to an expensive restaurant where he ordered the most exquisite dishes. The date couldn't have gone better. It felt like it was straight out of a fairy tale. Clearly, Cupid had already chosen the hearts of Michael and Jane as targets for his arrows. The date had everything: a lively conversation, a walk under the moon, and of course, the first kiss. Their relationship developed so quickly that just some 6 months into it, Jane and Michael decided to move in together. Since Jane's small rental house wasn't fit for the two of them, Michael moved the young woman to the luxurious mansion of his parents. Alfred and Holly Nelson turned out to be very nice people who happily accepted their son's fiancée. Moreover, they didn't care the least bit about Jane's deplorable financial situation, as frankly, she didn't have a cent to her name. Mrs. and Mr. Nelson were self-made people who worked hard to achieve their success. Thus, they knew the value of every dollar they earned. Jane is a very smart young lady, and hardworking too. She definitely won't go about throwing money left and right, Holly Nelson said proudly. And when Jane shared the news of her pregnancy, the Nelsons' joy knew no bounds. "I hope it's a boy, and I hope he becomes a quarterback just like I was," Alfred Nelson said dreamily. "It's definitely a boy. I can feel it," Jane said with a mysterious smile. By this time, the woman grew so attached to her fiancé's parents that she was ready to call them Mom and Dad. One day, feeling emotional, Jane told Mrs. Nelson about her late mother. As she told her story, Jane didn't fail to mention the fatal accident that claimed the life of Amanda Evans. But when Jane said her mother's name, Holly Nelson turned pale and clutched at her heart. "What happened? Are you all right?" Jane asked, worried. But Mrs. Nelson had already pulled herself together and tried to switch the topic of the conversation. She was very successful at that, but Jane decided not to read too much into what had just happened. However, later that day, she accidentally overheard a very strange conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Nelson. "Alfred, Jane is the daughter of Amanda Evans. Don't you get it? Our son hit and killed her on a crosswalk last year," said Holly Nelson, agitated. "How was I supposed to know it was her? And what can we do about it now? She's a good woman, and Michael loves her," the head of the family answered anxiously. Jane didn't wait for them to finish their conversation. Instead, she went to her room with tears in her eyes and started packing. Unfortunately, Michael stayed late at work that night, so he came home later than usual. By the time he got there, Jane had already left the Nelson family home and disappeared into the twilight. "There's no way I'm staying at the house of my mother's murderer. How did he even have the audacity to ask me to move in with him?" the woman thought, unable to stop crying. Of course, Michael tried his best to find his fiancée and bring her home, but he never succeeded. The situation was complicated by the fact that Jane was in her 7th month of pregnancy, and it was hard for her to take care of herself on her own. It was only a little later that Michael learned from his parents that Jane's mother died in that fatal accident a year ago. Did she think I was responsible for the death of Amanda Evans? But that wasn't my fault. Trying to get his fiancée to come back, Michael looked for her around the city every single day. Unfortunately, his best efforts didn't yield any results, except for making him feel worse and worse. 2 months passed, but there was still no sign of Jane. One day, while calling the hospitals and police stations yet again, Michael learned that an hour ago, some Jane Evans had been admitted to the maternity ward located on Main Street. The dispatcher of the medical services said that the woman was homeless and started having contractions on the street. Realizing that Jane needed help, Michael quickly dressed and hurried to the hospital. At the hospital, Michael learned that his fiancée was placed in a special room for the homeless, which didn't have the usual amenities and all the things required for women in labor. Michael explained his connection to Jane Evans and made sure she was examined by the hospital's best obstetricians. Fortunately, everything went well, and an hour and a half later, the birthing room was filled with the piercing crying of Jane's firstborn. "Well, Father, you have a son, and he's a big boy too, 9 pounds," the nurse on call said with a smile and cordially let Michael into the room. Seeing Jane holding her newborn son, the man ran up to her and knelt down. "Jane, honey, you got it all wrong. I didn't run over your mother. It was my brother, Peter. He was always troubled, and he already had a warning from the police. Our mother wanted to save him from going to prison, so she sent him to stay with our relatives in Canada, and she asked me to take the blame," Michael whispered with tears in his eyes. It was only now that Jane realized how wrong she was all this time. "Oh God, why didn't I just talk to you about all this?" Jane whispered with a sigh of relief. As it turned out, Jane spent 2 months living on the street, starving, only to avoid facing her mother's killer. But now, having learned the truth, Jane kissed her son tenderly and squeezed Michael's hand. Having felt the joy of motherhood just half an hour ago, the woman no longer wanted to start a new life with resentment and hatred in her heart. Instead, she looked tenderly at her men and whispered, "I love you both so much." At that moment, the nurse on call turned away to give them some privacy and dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Looking at the happy parents, she was sure that they would live a long and happy life together, full of beautiful moments only true love can bring into one's life.